moving on then, whilst we're impressed by the data related to Mitraclip and as a leaflet repair strategy, and we're aware of other repair approaches that may come along the line, there are limitations as well, particularly when we're dealing with really complex degenerative valve pathology like Barlow's, or indeed in terms of secondary MR reduction, where sure benefit risk ratio supports repair strategy, but there are now mitral valve replacement implantation prostheses that are being developed. And one can see parallels emerging to the surgical experience. We're still very early on, but Sam, can you give us just an overview of the sorts of devices that are available from a mitral valve replacement perspective, some of the particular challenges and where you see it fitting into this complex population group?
So I think many were hoping that we would discover the one device that could be used to replace the mitral valve in most patients. We certainly have that in aortic valve stenosis. And that just hasn't happened. And that's because of the complexity of the anatomy of the mitral valve, as Bushra alluded to. It's also because there is an issue with LVOT obstruction. So you create a new left ventricular outflow tract when you do mitral valve replacement. And if that's too small, the patient has risk of hemolysis and symptoms and dynamic LVOT obstruction, which can be a real problem. There is an issue around paravalvular leak because the mitral valve is not round. And there is also an issue with stasis, and this is often not commented on, but the reason aortic valve replacement is fairly straightforward from our perspective is because the aortic valve is by and large fairly round. It's in a rigid tube, but also it has very high velocity blood flow. Therefore, the risk of thrombosis on the leaflets or stasis around the entry point to the valve is very small. We have a real issue with mitral valve replacement where none of those things are the case. And I worry about mitral valve replacement in patients, particularly functional patients, where they have very large left atria, very slow flow, with their risk of thrombosis either of the valve leaflets or around the valve itself. The devices that are available at the moment fall into a number of different categories. My personal view is that in order to have a widely applicable mitral valve replacement device, it needs to be transeptal. Since these devices came into use, we all have a lot more experience of transeptal puncture. 10 years ago, you were very pleased if you achieved a transeptal puncture. Now we can be absolutely millimetre precise, thanks to working with people like Bushra, to know precisely where the transeptal is, to get the trajectory right, to make for a more straightforward transcatheter mitral valve replacement procedure. By going transeptally, all the access is venous, and you're avoiding the issues related to apical procedures, particularly in patients with secondary mitral regurgitation who have thinned ventricles and fragile tissue. So to me, I suspect that in the future, as you say, we don't need to relearn all the lessons the surgeons learned a long time ago. I feel that mitral valve replacement will be the standard for most patients. In a small proportion of patients, mitral valve replacement will be necessary, and that will be patients with small valves, patients with Barlow valves, and patients with very restricted or very restricted posterior leaflets. And I think that device has to be transeptal.
Where are we, do you think, in terms of timelines? We know this is going to contrast heavily with TAVI. Prediction is really difficult in this field. But do you see developments along that transeptal route over the next 5 to 10 years?
I think so. I've been involved with the SAPIEN M3 device, which is based on the SAPIEN valve used in the aortic position, and that involves a dock that goes around the mitral valve annulus. And that's a very neat solution to the problem. It's quite technically challenging to do the procedure. There's various new valves along similar lines. So the technology is there. I think the difficulty is not so much with the technology, it's around the case selection, actually, working out predicting we can predict what's going to happen to the left ventricular outflow tract reasonably well now, I think, but to predict patients who are most likely to benefit from these procedures and least likely to have complications related to them, I think we're at a pretty early stage of our learning.
And from an imaging perspective, I guess you mentioned this earlier on, that CT is particularly relevant when we're referring to the mitral valve implantation devices. Do you see procedurally a role of imaging in addition to echo imaging as an adjunct during our procedures in terms of optimising outcomes? Can you see development there?
Well, I mean, we have already these sort of hybrid labs, and we have various fusion imaging as well available to us. So I think it's already here. I think CT definitely has a role. How that fits into the cath lab at the time of the procedure, I'm not quite sure yet. But I think definitely yes, because CT offers a bit more detail, particularly of the ventricle, where echo has some limitations, and particularly for the access procedure. So I know we'd like to move away from transapical, but a lot of these transcatheter valve replacement therapies are transapical currently, and so therefore the role of CT I think definitely is there. But in terms of the cath lab, I'm not sure. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I think that's been a really great discussion highlighting the complexity of the field. At the present time, we have leaflet repair technology with Mitraclip accessible in this country, and hopefully we'll see innovations developing over the next few years which will help answer some of these unanswered questions. Thank you both, Bushra and Sam.
Thank you.